Hello, my name is Jay Wyatt. I am the Chief Information Accessibility Officer for the state of Minnesota. I had the honor of serving as the moderator for this session, Introduction to Accessibility Standards, the first session in our celebration of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We are kicking off today with a welcome for the Governor's Office.
Hello, everyone. Governor Walz here. I'm proud to proclaim today as Digital Accessibility Awareness Day in the state of Minnesota. All Minnesotans have a right to access government services and employment opportunities, whether in person or online. Creating accessible digital content and services is a shared responsibility, and every state employee has a role to play. Today, you'll hear from a variety of speakers on how to incorporate digital accessibility into the work you do. I hope that you'll take what you learn to help us better serve Minnesotans all across the state. Thank you for the work you've done and the work we'll continue to do together. And happy Digital Accessibility Awareness Day.
Thanks for Governor Walz for doing that. Now we're going to have our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Rochelle Bradley Montgomery. Dr. Bradley Montgomery has been working in accessibility and usability for over 20 years. She currently serves in the following roles: Digital Accessibility Specialist at the Library of Congress, co-chair of the W3C Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, Executive Director of Accessible Community, adjunct lecturer at the University of Maryland College of Information Studies, Wharton School, affiliate faculty with the Trade Center. Rochelle has a PhD from the University of Maryland College Park and a Master's in Science from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. When not working, Rochelle enjoys horseback riding and hiking with her family. Rochelle, thank you so much for taking time to present today. Everyone, please remember that we will take questions after the presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Rochelle now.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today. Do you mind going to the next slide? So I just wanted to kind of expand on my background briefly beyond the fantastic introduction. Thank you so much for that. I've been working in this area for quite a while, for about 20 years, maybe a little bit more than that. And I joined the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group back in 2016. I had the privilege to serve as the co-facilitator for the Cognitive and Learning Disabilities Task Force. It's often referred to as COGA, from 2019 to 2021. And I've been a co-chair since of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group since 2020. I joined the Library of Congress this past year in 2021, and I'm currently focusing on a couple different areas: accessibility and cultural heritage institutions, incorporating cognitive needs into the accessibility guidelines, and I'm sure you'll hear a little from me about that while I talk today, promoting adoption of accessibility in small organizations, and helping the next generation of accessibility professionals grow. So those are the perspectives I can bring to this talk, and I just wanted to introduce those. Go ahead and go to the next slide if you don't mind. So I just want to start by setting the stage. Like, what is the value of accessibility? Why is this so important that we talk about it, that we have a whole day dedicated to its awareness? It really does add value to everything we create from a technology standpoint. It increases your reach, depending on how you categorize disability. About 20% of the population has it. It can be more, again, depending on how you categorize it. And that number is increasing. We have an aging population. We recently had COVID, and we are now dealing with disabilities that we're still trying to understand from COVID. Disabilities can also be temporary. They can happen if you break a limb, if you have surgery, if you experience a concussion, for example. They can also be situational. So if you are tired or you are distracted, or even if you're working outside in bright light, it is a type of disability, even if it is not what we consider a permanent disability. Accessibility guidelines and following them and focusing on accessibility, it really improves the quality of everything we create, and it improves the overall user experience for everyone. Now, the Library of Congress maintains a set of free-to-use images of various themes. It's available from the LOC.gov webpage. And so I have highlighted some of those. We did a disability set back in October. and to celebrate Disability Employment Awareness Month. And so in this case, I have an image up of John Elper, who was a hero of Gettysburg, and he was recovering from his wounds, and so he at that time had a mobility impairment. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I want to talk today about evolving standards, and to do that, I need to kind of set the stage around what WCAG is and what it's not. So WCAG stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and as that kind of highlights, it is really around providing guidance for accessibility around web content. This guidance includes testable requirements for accessibility. It also includes support materials to help interpret and understand those requirements. WCAG is referred to in accessibility-related regulations worldwide. And so it has kind of become a standard which we use to understand how accessible content is or is not. But there's a few things that WCAG isn't. It is not usability guidance. In fact, there is an entire evaluation criteria when we're writing standards that says if it applies to absolutely everyone equally, it probably isn't accessibility guidance. It should, in some ways, disproportionately help people with disabilities to be accessibility guidance. It is also not law or regulation. It is produced by the W3C, and it is referenced by law and regulation, but that's not something the W3C does. Can you go to the next slide, please? I wanted to give some examples of how WCAG has evolved over time. The very first version, WCAG 1, really was pretty technology specific. And so an example criteria from that time was provide redundant text links for each active region of a server-side image map. Now, most of us aren't using image maps these days, and so the problem with being pretty technology specific is it becomes outdated rather rapidly. So when WCAG 2 was introduced later, it really had a goal of being technology agnostic, or as technology agnostic as it could be. It came out in 2008. It really kind of predated widespread mobile adoption. And you can see that when you look at the difference between WCAG 2.0 and you look at what we put out in WCAG 2.1. So an example from WCAG 0 is size text, and it states, except for captions and images of text, text can be resized without assistant technology up to 200% without the loss of content or functionality. It's a level AA requirement, and most laws and regulations that reference it use that as a standard. When WCAG 2.1 came out, we have an additional standard called Reflow. And the text for that says content can be presented without loss of information or functionality and without requiring scrolling in 2 dimensions for vertical scrolling content at a width equivalent to 320 CSS pixels and horizontal scrolling content at a height equivalent of 256 CSS pixels. Now, what that very simply translates to is you should be able to zoom to 400% and you shouldn't end up with 2 scroll bars. So it is a more stringent requirement than WCAG 2.0 had, because in 2.0 you could have 2 scroll bars, 1 horizontal and 1 vertical at 200% and pass. And the reason that happened is because responsive design came into play. We started developing for mobile, we have responsive design as a technique, and now we can provide the kind of support and the level of support for low vision that really is helpful. And so you have this evolution in the standards that accounts for the newer technology and allows us to really do something that serves the disability community more effectively. WCAG 2.1 has been out for a bit. We are currently working on WCAG 2.2. It will come available hopefully later this year. And an example from that also addresses some new technology really around authentication. And so one example from that is accessible authentication, and it says, for each step in an authentication process that relies on a cognitive function test, at least one other authentication method is available that does not rely on a cognitive function test. Or there's a mechanism available to assist the user in completing the cognitive function test. And so that might be something like a password management tool. So just to understand that a couple things from this, you'll see probably that as we have created new versions, the standards are getting a little longer. They are getting more technologically agnostic. and they are also addressing technology that is coming into the scene as it's coming in. Go to the next slide, please. One of my co-chairs, Alistair Campbell, often says this, and I think it's really something to keep in mind when you're looking at standards and trying to understand them. A guideline can be easy to understand, it can be easy to test or short, pick any two. And so this is something that we struggle with. We really need to create things that are testable. We need to create things that are understandable. As a result, they are less and less often short. If you move on to the next slide, please. I want to talk about why these standards evolve. Like, why do we have a 2.2? Why are we talking about a WCAG 3? What motivates that? And there's a couple reasons, and I'm hoping you can see those from the examples I was talking about. Standards evolve because they don't meet or fully meet the needs they were written to address. And so technology changes. Mobile, touch screens, augmented reality, virtual reality, all of these things have come into play over the last 15 years or are in process of becoming increasingly important in our environments. The need also may not have been met fully in the first place, and I will talk about the cognitive space. They're really, WCAG 2 addressed in many ways, many of the standards address cognitive accessibility, but they don't fully address that need. And so additional standards, additional guidance are needed to be able to address that. And the other reasons they change is we learn how to write a better standard. And I will talk a little bit about that with regards to WCAG 3.0. Can you go to the next slide, please? Something to understand about the 2X series. And when I say the 2X series, I mean WCAG 2.0, 2.1, 2.2. It does have constraints. So WCAG 2 was a big step forward, and it really did promote adoption into the regulatory environment, which was a great success for it, but it had to have some constraints in place in order to do that. The first one is it really focuses in on testing at a component level. And so it's testing an image, it's testing a component or an interactive element. It doesn't have really great support for the concept of testing across a user process. And it doesn't even really have a great scoping for a site or a holistic element. We talk about set of web pages as a collection of web pages that share a common purpose and are created by the same author. But that still has a little bit of ambiguity in it. There's also no ability to test based on context. And a simplistic example of that is around cognitive accessibility. It would be great to have some standards that talk about simplifying language so it makes it easier for people to understand. But how we do that in English is different than we would do it in Hebrew. For example, Hebrew includes diacritics and has the habit of not always including all the letters. That's not a problem we have in English. English has other challenges, Hebrew doesn't. But when we're looking at a worldwide standard, right now, within the WCAG 2 series, we don't have a way of saying, if you're using this language, do this, and if you're using this language, do that. We also have this concept of backward compatibility, which is incredibly important from a regulatory standpoint, but really means that we rarely change normative texts. We rarely change the language of the guidelines themselves, which is why we end up with a situation where we have resized text, which is the 200% zoom, and we have reflow, which is the 400% zoom. We don't want to go back and remove or alter the existing guidance, and so we kind of add on to it. And I talked already about the fact that we really do have this concept of that eliminates usability guidance when it's really helpful for everyone. It typically doesn't end up in our standards. We end up in many ways with this limitation when we're writing standards. Everyone can look at something and say, that is not accessible. They know it when they see it, but writing it within the framework in a testable way has proven very challenging. I do, though, want to talk about kind of WCAG 2.1, because that's out, it's available. So if you'll go to the next slide, I want to talk about what came with that. What did we do in WCAG 2.1 that wasn't addressed in WCAG 2.0? So WCAG 2.1 provides greater support for low vision users. It helps also helps general users work in a mobile environment, because we often walk outside, and a lot of the contrast requirements and support requirements that help low vision individuals also help in high sunlight, high light mobile environments. A great deal of this is really, again, about implementing responsive design. And so Reflow is a new standard, and it requires more adaptability from the content and allows for greater magnification. Non-text contrast requires contrast for objects that are not text, so it sets a requirement of 3:1 for those, but those objects are still conveying information. The text spacing requirement really supports minimal changes in letter spacing and line spacing that improves readability. And the content on hover and focus supports working with a magnifier and interacting with content, hover content in particular, with a magnifier. If you go to the next slide. The other area that, I'm pausing for the next slide to come up, thank you. The other area that it supports is mobile and touch guidance. And so really one of the big improvements in mobile is around, or one of the big considerations in mobile is around, what do you do when a device is fixed? So for individuals with some mobility impairments, they may have their mobile device attached to a wheelchair or another object. And in those cases, you don't move the device and you don't change the orientation of the device. And that's what some of these motion actuation and orientation is around. It's around making sure there's another way to do functionality if you aren't actually physically moving a mobile device or a touch device. Pointer gesture and cancellation are really around supporting that touch interaction and making sure that it can be used with a single pointer, often a finger, but not always. And then target size is a AAA requirement. So it's not usually referenced in the regulatory environment, but it sets a minimum target size at 44 by 44 pixels, and it's really supporting that touch interaction. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the other area that WCAG 2.1 starts to work on is the cognitive area and supporting people with cognitive and learning disabilities. So identify input purpose, identify purpose as a general one, and status messages here really are about providing context to the content that is generated. And when that context, that purpose is provided, tools can actually go in and help adapt and represent that content in a way that helps people with cognitive disability. So it may add an image that relates to that purpose. It may change the location of the content based on creating a standard design for people to interact with, but really getting that purpose in there is critical to being able to do those kinds of interactions. Status messages also support screen reader users and allows for more interaction from the screen reader side. Label and name reduces confusion that happens when the text-to-speech or the screen reader is providing different information than the visual information. So when a sighted user sees a button and the back end is a link and they have different names, it's very hard to bring those together, and that can be confusing for people in the cognitive space. It can be confusing for people who are also using a screen reader. And then finally, timeouts is about warning people if inactivity is going to lead to a timeout that causes data loss. So these again are different standards that are building on what we already had in 2.0, but are trying to help and improve the support for people with cognitive disabilities. If you go to that next slide, the next area is kind of the other guidance. It doesn't fall in one of those categories. So first of all, character key shortcuts. This does not happen often, but it happened enough that a standard got written, and it's about supporting voice control. If you are creating something with a single letter keyboard shortcut, like you hit the letter A and it does something, you want to let people adjust that. And generally, it's better to avoid it. And that's what that guidance is around. It's really to reduce accidental activation when voice control is on. Then animations from interactions is really focusing around supporting people who have vestibular disorder and not causing or triggering that. That's a AAA requirement. Label and name, as I mentioned, is a support for screen reader users as well as cognitive users. And the concurrent input mechanisms is about letting people switch from the mouse to the keyboard to voice interaction and back and forth in a way that is smooth and provides that kind of support. We'll go to the next slide. So that's WCAG 2.1. That's really what's built on in that. But what's coming in 2.2? So there are a number of additional standards that support people with cognitive disabilities, support a little bit more mobile, support things around e-publication. And so that's page break navigation is very specific to e-publication. And then also around focus appearance. Many of these are guidance that we were working on getting in 2.1, and they were complex enough and had enough edge cases that they required a lot more work. And so that is what's coming in the next round. And then if you go to the next slide, I just want to highlight and briefly address WCAG 3. Clayton Lewis has said, just because we don't know how to do something doesn't mean it can't be done. And again, this is a quote we hear in the guidelines working group repeatedly. WCAG 3 is trying to address those constraints I talked about to really help us build a better set of standards. We are finding that within the 2X model, we have diminishing returns. It is harder and harder to write the standards, and they affect fewer and fewer groups of people. The success criteria that we're getting to, it's just we need to adapt the standards, and to do that, we need to move to a new series. WCAG 3 is a challenge. There are additional goals we have beyond just being technology agnostic. We really want to try to expand the categories of disabilities that we are supporting, and we want to try to find a way to motivate people to pick up some of the additional guidance. Some of the things I read were AAA requirements, and a lot of times people don't pay attention to the AAA because they are not legally required. But there is so much fantastic guidance in the AAA criteria. We want to find a way to encourage people to pay attention to that. So that is in process. It won't be out for at least 4 years, but it's something to just be aware of. Next slide. I think a question we all run into when we kind of look at this landscape of standards is, when should I adopt? And I recommend you really consider the cost of adoption against the gain. And in particular, this can be very different for new development versus older development. And sometimes it's a judgment call by the overall organization, and sometimes it's also a judgment call by the individual project. And sometimes projects will choose to adopt more rigorous standards than the organization as a whole. And that's often because new development provides opportunities to pick something up that is much easier then than it's going to be in 4 years or 5 years down the road. A great example, responsive design. If you are doing new development and your organization is currently at 2.0, for example, I always recommend people pick up responsive design, even though it's a 2.1 standard and supports 2.1 standards. And that's because it is so tough if you pick a toolkit that doesn't support responsive design to go back and do it later. So sometimes being aware of the standards that are coming is a really good proactive approach to doing design and just makes things easier long term. The other thing to consider is the impact, and especially from the movement from 2.0 to 2.1, there is a big impact because it addresses the mobile and touch technology. So it's really creating those base standards, and the mobile audience has increased dramatically. You have to assume that people are interacting with your content in a mobile environment, at least sometimes. And so those 2.1 standards have just become so very, very important at this point. The last thing to consider is the level of change. Anything in the 2 series is additive. It is not a dramatic shift in how we test and how we think from each other. It's just additional requirements to be aware of. The jump to 3.0 is really going to be more dramatic, and we expect it to take much longer for organizations to pick that up. And so thinking about that and considering that as part of your decision about when to adopt, when to move forward is also an important one. And I think the last slide is opening the question and answer session. So questions, and I realize as I have gone through, I have not always highlighted the images here. The one on the question slide is an image of deaf children in Cincinnati, Ohio, singing the Star Spangled Banner in sign language.
Thank you, Michelle. That was amazing. I've been following and studying the guidelines for years, and so I know WCAG 2.0, 2.1, and so forth. But what you did put all of this in just better context, to have a better understanding of why are we doing this, rather than focusing just on the minutia of we need to do this particular standard. So I think it really helped provide a lot of context. So let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Waiting to see. I do have a question while I'm looking for anybody else. Number one is, if you were a project manager or somebody in the general technology realm, but you're not a detailed person, but you need to understand more about 2.1, how would you suggest the person learn more about it? Where would they go to learn more about 2.1?
There are a lot of, the W3C puts out a lot of interpretive guidance. And so I think going there is a really helpful place to start. I can provide a set of links after this if that would be helpful for you to share in some form. But really starting with, I think, the W3C site, but also so many of the different organizations provide additional material. I really love what WebAIM provides, so I think that's a great place to start as well. But DQ, Level Access, TPGI also provide a great amount of data. And so I think looking for those articles, looking for that content, all of those provide great places to kind of get more information.
Thank you, Rachel. I think one of the challenges we have, I know I have, is that there's lots of good things here, there, and there. You kind of have to pick things away. And so we're going to try and create a curriculum, for example, for our state employees. Instead of saying, okay, here's the curriculum, start with this, start with this, start with that. It's more like, watch for this webinar, watch for that webinar. So I think it's an ongoing challenge, is how to get people engaged in it. They're not deeply invested in accessibility as part of their job.
I completely agree. There is so much information out there. If you're really starting from scratch, the Introduction to Accessibility course at the W3C is a great place. Understanding the difference between 2.1 and 2.0, that can be a little harder to find it, like the perfect resource for.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I'm going to check again to see if there are any other questions from the audience. Right now, we don't have any particular questions. So I think I have another question. Oh, and by the way, guys, everybody, if you have questions and you're thinking about something, please feel free to type it into the chat, and I'll read it from the chat. Or if you want to ask the question yourself verbally, just say +1 or next in the chat, and we'll identify you by name. And then if you wish to turn on your microphone or your video, you can do that. So this is more participatory environment as well. And while we're waiting for that, what I also like to ask you about is, we've been looking at, our group of people in this state. Oh, by the way, I'm going to pause myself. We have a question here. I've got to find it. So Danielle Gora asked, is there somewhere to refer people to when you're trying to share the basic with coworker? And I think he said the W3C, but could you be a little more specific, perhaps?
Trying to pull up a link for you, but they're really, as the very first pass to share with individuals, there's a small set of videos that W3C put out that just introduces the concepts and the value of accessibility. And I always start there. I think that's a great place to go. If you're taking that next step and you're introducing a developer to the standards and you want them to just start to get a touch point, the WebAIM provides a checklist for both 2.0 and 2.1 that I think has consolidated the critical things you need to know and think about into a single page that helps people a great deal. So I often use that as another touch point. And again, it depends a little bit on which goal you have. And if you have a particular goal, I encourage you to type it in here and I'll try to point you to a resource that addresses that goal if it wasn't one of those two. Jenny, thank you so much for putting in the link for those videos. They provide little short 2-minute intros, so you can insert them in a quick snippet if you're sending out a newsletter, or you can an email. I think the whole thing together is 10 minutes, and they really are helpful for both raising awareness and just getting people started in understanding this.
Thank you. And also, Gail Jones pointed out that W3C, which you and I use all the time, if you're familiar with it, stands for the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3 and the letter C, and then you can find the rest from that. And Stacy Walker also asked a question. Stacy Walker just wanted to know, she's in charge of the Transformation Office, and she said for the awareness of the group, the Transformation Office and the Office of Accessibility are working together to evaluate how we can build this knowledge into the modernization playbook for the project management lifecycle. And that is focused on agencies as well as on technical people.
I think I can paste in a chat. Nobility and Teach Access, and I put together a talk a couple weeks ago, and we started a collaborative resource for teaching about accessibility. And so I just put a link in, and it just includes a number of links to other resources that you may find helpful. And please feel free to add more to it. It's just a shared Google Doc that we are building over time.
We absolutely will. Thank you, Rochelle. And Scott Tyson asked if you wanted to begin including some 2.1 standards in upcoming projects referencing your project concept. Are there a couple of standards you would recommend starting with? Are there some that are easier to implement or have benefit to a wide group of users?
There's a couple ways to parse this, and it's such a great question, so thank you. If I am starting a project off from scratch, I'm going to typically start with the design-centered standards, so things around color contrast, around layout, around heading structure. And also, again, responsive design, so picking your toolkit from a development standpoint, thinking about how you're going to support magnification. Does the toolkit you're picking to build from, when I say toolkit, I mean things like React or Vue or Bootstrap or any pre-made set of code you're going to work from, understanding how that supports accessibility. Toolkits that you can go in and custom code to add the accessibility pieces are much easier to work with than a toolkit that hides a lot of that and makes it hard for you to adapt the components. And so those are, it's not quite the same answer as you were going for, but those are the two places I start when I'm beginning a project. If I'm retrofitting a project, there's another way of looking at the standards, which is what can be automatically tested and what requires a lot of human intervention. And so starting with the things that are easy to test and validate and understand, so you can use a testing tool to do really comprehensive testing quickly, that's a great place. So you're going to find things like, does it have a title? Is there an alt tag in there for images? So the standards that really tie into that automatic testing. Then it's nice to kind of take a next step into things that are augmented. So it says, hey, maybe this image alt tag isn't a great representation. Let's think about how we write alternative text, or let's improve the alternative text. It's kind of a next step. And so either of those approaches when you're starting out, I think works well and forms an introduction for people who are getting into this area.
This is Jay. I think that's great advice, especially the toolkit part. We've been investing in this accessibility journey. It's been sometimes frustrated to see a lot of accessibility experts talk about how things are easy, and then they go in and go right into the code. And my point is, a lot of developers never work at that level. They don't work at that code level. They work above that code level. And having more advice about how to work at that level, I think, would make a huge difference for a lot of people. Now, Lolly, yes, I'm sorry, you go ahead. And then
I was just going to respond to that in many ways, when creating training, the initial level has to be at the HTML level, but then based on where you're talking about it, you have to then have that conversation, exactly as you're saying, based on the toolkits that are being used. They are very, very different. So, great point.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Lolly, you're on.
Thanks. This is Lolly. Can you talk a little more about the concepts you're thinking about for the 3 series?
Sure. So we went ahead and published the WCAG 3 series as the first public working draft. And I cannot stress enough that the challenges we've laid in front of us as far as requirements are hard. Among other things, we've got the technology neutral. We want to make sure it encourages adoption. We want to make sure that we're really spanning more disability areas, including intersectional disabilities. And so those are things that aren't addressed in the current one. We don't have great support around voice control yet. And again, then individuals who are deaf and blind need slightly different support than people who are deaf, people who are blind. And so looking at those areas. So those are some of the goals we're trying to get to. Our initial approach to it was to look at rating scales. Like, can we expand testing from a pass-fail point of view and do something like on a 1 to 5 rating scale? And that's what we put out as our first public working draft. We get a lot of great feedback back, one of which was a concern around subjectivity versus an inter-rater reliability. So if 3 people tested, are they all going to get the same result? And we decided to switch approaches. What we are exploring now, and you'll see it in the editor's draft in the next few weeks, is around these I should say, I think it hasn't been approved. It will be in the editor's draft, but it's this concept of, can we change how we think about tests? So when something becomes more subjective, can we think about what we're testing? So going back to that English versus Hebrew level, can we have a type of test that does take context into account, so that we have a guideline that says, make the language simple. I'm again oversimplifying this, but make the language simple. And then it says, if you're working in English, do this. If you're working in Hebrew, do that. All of that is very drafty, and please don't hold me to it formally, because it's very much in process. But it's also, you can absolutely see those in the notes and the minutes and the documents if you dug into our working group. But that's kind of the direction we're heading right now. And we're hoping that over the next few months, we're going to start iterating our drafts so people can provide feedback and see more and more. We've been a little more focused on getting WCAG 2.2 out the door. So that's shifting as we're wrapping it up. Did that answer your question?
You.
This is Jay. Thank you. That was a great answer, and I would like to take a little bit on that answer as well. And you talked about the testability thing. I was involved in a presentation yesterday when I had to explain that the testability is really binary. For the test criteria themselves, maybe pass fail. We rarely say a HR application is fully accessible. I mean, there's always upgrades, there's always a different module, there's always different. So how do we measure that? And so I think when we talk about things like update even 2.0 or 2.1, a lot of the IT managers worry that, well, that means now all of a sudden it has to be fully accessible to 2.1. And we have to find a way to say, well, yes, but not really, in a way that does not let them off the hook. But at the same time, have them understand, how do you manage the breadth of what we mean by accessibility? And I don't know if you'd like to make a comment about that as well.
I always describe accessibility as a journey. It is something that we are constantly working to improve, and a path that we want to make sure we're on, and we can see the goal, but we may not be at the goal right now. It doesn't mean that it's not worth continuing that journey, continuing that improvement. That is a question that 3.0 is also trying to tackle, is what's good enough, and to just build on what you mentioned. Alt text, take a very simple example. An image that is fairly decorative out in the corner of something that doesn't have alt text has a much lower impact than an icon that you have to click in order to finish out a process, for example. So there is a weight that WCAG 2 doesn't take into account to different standards. And that is a human judgment call. It is very hard to put into a pass-fail context. And so people are exploring, we don't have answers yet, but we are exploring this question of how do you think about that? And the first public working draft talked about it from this concept of critical errors, that there are some times that something should absolutely always fail, and sometimes there may be a little more ambiguity in that. I'm not sure where that will fit in this new direction we're going, but I'm sure we will revisit it in some way, because I do think that priority, that 100% need, is something that we've heard of concerns about and have been requested to answer, but we don't have those answers yet.
Absolutely. And it's a challenge as we explore the journey of accessibility. And with that, I'd like to say, I think we're out of questions and also out of time. So I really want to thank you so much, Dr. Rochelle Bradley Montgomery, for being here with us today, for sharing your valuable time with us. And I think we got so much out of it. Again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
So do I. We have 5 more sessions to go, and we're looking forward to holding every single one of them. So again, have a great Global Accessibility Awareness Day, everyone, and enjoy the day and the beautiful sunny May day that we have here in Minnesota.